Yeah. This hoe say she got nobody close. Bitch, I know you a hoe. Bitch, I know you gon' float. Bitch, I ain't doing the most. If I need a vacation, I fly to the coast. Dose. Yeah, tripping off dose.
Hello guys. It's been a while, a very long time actually. Um, yeah, I'm sorry about that. I know there's not many people actually watching this as of right now, so I'm not gonna worry about that too much. But uh, right now my setup isn't exactly the greatest. Honestly, it's literally just a crappy laptop and my, regular headphones. But hopefully this could get me through for now, because after a while I realized that if I really want this series or videos to take off, I really got to do something about it instead of just waiting for people to ask for more. So here we are. Um, Thanks for, being patient with me, despite the quality. Hopefully you can, bear with it for now and look past that as I try to talk about some topics concerning this video game we all like to play called Shinobi Striker. And thank you for, sticking around once again. And thanks to all of those that helped me in the creation of this video, getting the clips, advice or advisements on, certain things within the game and its interactions, to help me keep all this information relevant and as useful as possible. If at any time you think I'm missing something, whether it be vital information or a point, do not be afraid to try and correct me. I'm not perfect. I don't know everything. I would love to, but I'm human. And hopefully, we can work together and try and educate as many people in this community. So, without further ado, let's actually get into what we are working with this video. Alright, so let's get into it. The meat and potatoes. What is a neutral game, right? So, if we go to like FGC like terms, right? A neutral game basically describes a point in a match where both players are standing and neither of them has an advantage over the other. People are just waiting for opportunities to make a move or waiting for your opponent to make a mistake to capitalize on it. That is essentially what neutral game is, right? But in Shinobi Striker, can you even say that we have a neutral game? Like, it's not really just a fighting game, it's like a whole different breed, right? But depending on how you play, right, the neutral game can or cannot exist, right? There's a lot of builds and play styles in this game that enable you or anyone else to be in a constant state of advantage, right? So that basically makes the neutral game mute. Like, for example, somebody always has super armor or always has a way to avoid damage regardless of what you're doing. Like, there is no neutral game because they always have an advantage over you. Although you can still use some of these techniques to, apply pressure and eventually create your own advantage or opening. That being said, right, if the game is being played in a way where both players are on equal ground or have equal chance to do damage to each other, there is a neutral game that you can play within SS. But how do we define that neutral game for SS, right? The way I would define it is that neutral game for SS is when you and your opponent are locked onto each other, right? You haven't yet attacked each other and you're both sizing each other up. Say it's the beginning of a pit match. You don't know what your opponent has equipped, but you can take a look at what class type he is, what outfit he's wearing. That might give you a tell what abilities he's about to use, and so on and so forth, right? And that right there is like the beginning of neutral game, and then after that, it's just you maybe dashing around or near your opponent to try and see what he's doing, try to poke and prod at him till a fight eventually starts. That is what the neutral game for Shinobi Striker looks like. And like I said before, there's a lot of cases where, that doesn't really happen. People just straight up attack you on sight. And so there's no like reason to employ any of these strategies, right? But like I said before, assuming that you and your opponent are in equal standing or, advantage, you guys got to be wary of each other, right? And so this is where all of this comes in. So I briefly went over what charge attacks were in my last video and what their applications are, but now I want to talk about its mechanics in depth, right? So in SS, charge attack distance is signified by the shade of the color of your lock-on circle, right? Doesn't matter whether it's green or red just yet. So depending on the color or the dimness of your lock-on circle, it signifies how close you need to be to actually be in range to initiate a charge attack. So once you're within distance, you can then use your charge attack to then start a combo, right? This is a tangent, but when you need to lock off or on, right? Like, there's a lot of different situations where, like, being locked on or off is preferable, but more often than not, you want to be locked onto your opponent. But there are a few exceptions to that, right? So, whenever you're too close to a wall or your opponent happens to somehow get out of your line of sight extremely fast, it's best to, lock off of your opponent and turn the camera manually because whenever you're locked on, it reduces your camera sensitivity. So you turn slowly, right? So, you can maintain focus on what you're already locked onto. But if you can't find whoever you were locked onto, that's obviously a problem. So lock off, scan around you, and then lock on if needed. All right, putting that tangent aside, right? Um, Whenever you're in range for a charge attack, this opens up a lot of options for what you can do in neutral, but I'll cover that later, specifically moving tech. Aside from that, whenever you enter a charge attack range, you should assume that your opponents are in range as well. So you need to keep in mind that they can attack you as well. Grasping that distance, getting used to it, not having to just rely solely on the visual on your screen allows you to like barely dance on that line between being in range and out of range. And you want to be able to manage that so your opponent doesn't have enough, isn't close enough to always hit you, but you might be just barely close enough to get tracking on your projectiles, right? And whenever you're in that range and playing that neutral, you're keeping your enemy at bay, you're trying to force him to aggress you or them to aggress you in that specific situation. And this matters because class types have their own unique charge attack ranges, excluding shinobi boosts that can affect that, or certain buffs, right? These differences can actually like help you play neutral or decide how to play neutral. Because if you're a class type that has good, attack charge range, for example, attack, or the red class, the Craigs, everybody calls them. You have more range than a healer, so you can engage from a farther distance from a healer could in terms of attack charging, and you'll be able to hit them first, assuming you initiate your attack charge first, simply because you started your animation before they did, right? Speaking of which, your charge attack's animation speed is also extremely important when it comes to doing one-on-one situations, because being able to get your hit off first can guarantee that you get to start your combo and the opponent doesn't get their hit off starting theirs, right? And animation speed is affected by a plethora of different things, whether it could be your shinobi boosts, your actual buffs at the time, maybe debuffs as well. And sometimes weapons have their own unique animation speeds because of their weapon stats, or purely because how the weapon is animated. So you need to pay attention to those things because that can really decide the flow of a fight. If your weapon doesn't have good charge attack speed or distance or just weapon attack speed, that might rule out using charge attacks as an aggressive option completely. And that also matters in comparison to your opponent's weapon too. Because if you know if their weapon is slower than yours, that means you could be much more aggressive, and keep charging them because you know they won't be able to hit you in time, right? But if it's the opposite, that means you have to be a little bit more passive, or you have to use your other options, as we'll talk about that later in the video. All right, so the next important thing that I need to talk about regarding neutral gaming Shinobi Striker is movement. Assuming that you and your opponent have an equal amount of advantage, there's many play styles and techniques that you can use during neutral, you know, to try and gain that advantage, right? But how you move is one of the most important factors in that regard because moving correctly can mean avoiding ninjutsu, ninja tools, and even some secret techniques. And being able to do that allows you to hold on to your sub, reduce the amount of damage you take to your health. It means you can take more hits and play for longer without consuming any of your options or, your ninja tool, your ninjutsu. I'm referring to those as options if you couldn't really tell. Um, I don't know how the rest of the community refers to this type of movement, but I know these as momentum jumps. Momentum jumps are a certain combination of movement actions that allow you to move faster and more evasive. Those are the words I would like to describe it. Essentially, it involves you, the player, looping these two inputs. Essentially, you will jump, dash, and then jump again in whatever direction you need to, right? If you know what I'm talking about, it's going to be obvious, but I'll have a clip up on screen so you can see what I'm saying. But doing this type of movement allows you to avoid damage more often than not. It's not perfect, especially if you don't have this type of movement mastered. But as you can see in the clip I provided here, it can be very, very useful in just avoiding straight ninjutsu and random people trying to hit you, as well as just effectively just moving across the map. Um, and these types of movements, like specifically movement actions, tend to have evasion like frames. I don't know the exact terminology for it, but this is what I'll call it for the sake of the video. But whenever your character has streaks coming off of their body, right, you're in like an evasive state, which means you have like ninja tools track you less for those few frames, and if you're close enough to the attack or the source of the attack, you can become completely invincible to it, and that allows you to get through some attacks without taking damage or having to use your sub. This is very useful because it's very cheap on you. It doesn't cost you anything to do those types of things. So by chaining the jumps and your dashes together, you can stretch the amount of time you have for your evasion frames, right? This technique doesn't exactly make you invincible while you're jumping, as you can see in the demo clip, but the evasion frames that you get make it hard for ranged projectiles to hit you, and some attacks have less tracking, like I mentioned before. So the longer you're in that state, hence why you're doing a jump dash jump, the harder it is to hit you and even catch you, right? And as you can see in the clip that I provided, you can change direction like often, right? So you can turn on a dime if you need to, so you can turn back around to avoid an attack that you see coming straight towards you, or change directions because you know that an opponent is about to launch a big projectile at you. All right, so that's the first type of important movement tech that you want to know for neutral. The next type of movement tech that you need to know is another thing that I don't know what the entire community calls at large, but I refer to it as like, grounded dash canceling, right? But basically, you're using your charge attack to initiate your first burst of momentum, dashing to cancel that burst of momentum, and then initiating the charge attack again repeatedly until you close the gap on your opponent. As you may see on screen with the demo clip that I provided, that it looks much faster than normal movement, and you're able to zip around and left and right while closely approaching your opponent. And just like the previous type of movement, doesn't make you invincible, but makes you very hard to hit. Mastering it and using it effectively, because honestly, in this clip, I'm just going all over the place, just to show what it looks like. But you don't really want to do like all those twists and turns unless you believe it to be necessary. You really just want to close the gap first, and if you notice that your opponent's about to launch a projectile at you, then you do use the side to side. But by doing this type of movement while grounded, it can really help you close the gap on an opponent, especially if they've never seen that type of movement before. That can really throw them off, and it allows you to, really take advantage of your evasion frames, because if you notice on almost every movement that I'm doing there, like there's some streaks coming off of my character, and that's why it's so hard to get hit when you're doing that type of movement. So let's move on to the next section of the video. Alright, so this next section of the video is going to be talking about resource management. I mentioned it in passing before, just like in other video games, you have multiple options to use in the middle of a fight. So what are those options, you ask? Your options are your weapon, your ninjutsu, your ninja tool, your ultimate secret technique, your substitution, and even your guard reflex. Carefully choosing when and how to use those options is crucial to gaining the advantage in any fight. For example, if you have an option, right, whether that be a ninja tool or a ninjutsu, right, that can break guards, you want to use it optimally by forcing your opponent to guard so that you can break it, instead of just throwing out that move or tool and just hoping it does damage, let alone what it's really capable of, right? Um, you gotta start thinking about like how to use your ninjutsu in ways that really benefit you while being a disadvantage to your opponent, instead of just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? So, upon seeing your opponent for the first time, you have to pay attention for to a few things. As I mentioned before, you want to pay attention to class type, what weapon they're using, and the loadout they might be using. It's not immediately apparent, but obviously they're going to use it in ninjutsu. So you need to pay attention and be like, okay, he has this move and that move and this ninja tool with that sub, right? Because if you don't know what they're using, you decide to charge in anyway, there's a chance you might get hit by a counter jutsu or a trap that you didn't know they had until it's too late, right? You just gave up your sub for no reason, right? So being, aware of what they have and what they can do to you is just as important as what you can do to them, right? So just, observe your opponent for a little bit. You don't have to do it for too long, maybe a few seconds, as you're getting close to them, and then decide to do it from there. Obviously, there's a lot of builds that can bypass that part of the neutral game, as I mentioned before. If you're confident enough in being able to just react to whatever they have, you can just ignore that too, right? But there's also jutsu like Sharingan, Sakura Hikona, or counters like Boruto Stream or Acrobatic that allow you to just be able to negate somebody who's being a little too aggressive. So you have to watch out for those things, right? There's a lot of jutsu that can punish you if you just charge at people without paying attention. So once you know what your opponent has, what tools they can use against you, right? You start trying to get them to use those tools, empty out their cooldowns and stuff. As soon as you get their cooldowns, right, they don't have anything to defend themselves with. That is if they have longer cooldowns. If they have shorter cooldowns, they still, for a shorter window are vulnerable in terms of not being able to do big damage to you. But you just gotta be careful and pay attention to how long those cooldowns are. You know. So the next big thing is subs, and subs are connected to your guard as well in a way, right? So if an opponent gets too close and in the middle of battle, or I guess towards the beginning of a fight, you will often reflect them away to gain some space, right? Guard reflex are extremely important when it comes to maintaining neutral game, because if you can reflect your opponent, you can basically put each other back at square one, right? Especially if you have enough speed to make the distance bigger, or if you have like a movement ability that can do that same thing. All right, so putting you guys essentially back at square one, starting the fight over again. And that's really important because a guard free flex is essentially free as long as you don't rely on it too much and end up getting your guard broken, which is something you don't want, obviously, right? But if you use guard reflex well, and you space out the amount of time between reflex, you can effectively just keep reflecting your opponent forever. And you know, at that point, the longer that little neutral game goes on, the more aggressive your opponent's gonna get because they want to start doing some meaningful damage. So they might use a ninjutsu or a ninja tool to get you to do something else instead of reflecting, right? And that forces them to use up one of their options while you still have all of yours. And then after that point, you've gotten their ninjutsu. um they're pretty aggressive, so they have a few openings. This is when you want to start getting their sub. Baiting your opponent's sub is extremely important because the sub is this game's version of a combo breaker. You get stuck in a combo, you press the sub button, and now you're out, basically scot free. But there's some risks with that because if you sub and just assume that your opponent can't catch you after that, you're gonna be in for a rude awakening. I'm sure you guys already know that. So if you end up subbing right after getting hit by an attack, try to be defensive. You don't have to be passive, but you have to be defensive because the opponent knows that you are now vulnerable to being comboed, right? Like you can get put in an extended combo that can possibly kill you. In this game, most combos will kill you if the player knows what they're doing. All right. So using the advanced movement text that I explained before, you can, live for a little bit long enough for your sub to cool down, and you can start being just as aggressive as your opponent, right? Putting you guys back into neutral, right? And this game goes back and forth until eventually somebody dies, right? And I guess that's the whole point, right? But you want to make sure that you are managing your opponent's cooldowns just as much as you're managing your own cooldowns. Being aware of all of these things can allow you to turn the tide of a battle. Like being able to empty your opponent's sub and then capitalize on it by either getting through their guard or catching them before they even finish touching the ground after subbing. It allows you, to get that full combo that everybody loves to do. All right, so with that, we're getting to the end of the video, and I just want to reiterate that like everything discussed in this video isn't, crucial to the way you can play this game. There's tons of different ways to play and experience this game, and this is by no means the right way or the good way to do it, right? But this is just a way that I think is more engaging and more fun because it involves you, to use your noggin when you play, right? And I guess, there's always a time and place for that, right? But more often than not, I would like to believe that everybody likes to use their brains a little bit whenever they play anything. But I, made this video with the intent to spread knowledge, right? And hopefully help people improve their game a little bit and, talk about some topics that nobody really does talk about in Shinobi. If you think there's anything that I missed or anything that you can add as a viewer, please go down in the comments and let me know. I would definitely like to, learn more because, as you can see from my gameplay, I'm nowhere near perfect. I consider myself a decent player, but there's a lot of things I can improve upon, right? And, hopefully through this, this relationship that I grow with the community, that happens, right? But, you know, all of this is just to say that I'm thankful for you guys watching, everybody else that helped me, put these clips together, and, you know, hopefully I get my setup better and everything because, quality of this video isn't great. Edits probably aren't that great either, but at the end of the day, this is supposed to be informative. So if you learn something from this, that's all that matters. And, I don't really care about my, socials or stats that much, but if you liked, you can leave a like. Just subscribe if you feel like it. I don't really care. But you know, uh, yeah, I don't really have much to say. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I can come up with another video for you guys to see soon. Peace.
Top of the morning is very important with Paul before this snoring. I get the topic she wanna record it, I'll never say no, that's boring. I pop the Molly pill for real, in 35 minutes I'm soaring. Geeked up, my teeth torturing gums, I'm one of the ones. I need a son, I'm tired of teach these niggas who ain't my seed. I know I'm blood, but I get head instead whenever you bleed. Top of the morning, baby girl, get up, get out my house. This the crib of dreams, millionaires sleep on my couch. All we really got is us, little brother, we all we need.